The date is January 11th, 2026, and the financial arteries of the Islamic Republic of Iran are bleeding out in real time. In the boardrooms of Tehran, in the fortified vaults of the central bank, and in the encrypted communications of the Revolutionary Guard, a single terrifying reality has taken hold. The United States has not fired a single missile at Iranian soil, yet the Iranian economy is experiencing a collapse more devastating than any military campaign could achieve. The Iranian rial has lost 40% of its value in just 3 weeks. The foreign currency reserves that once cushioned the regime against external shocks have evaporated. The banking system is on the verge of total paralysis, and the Iranian people, already suffering under decades of sanctions, are watching their savings turn to dust. To understand what is happening right now, we must look beyond the surface rhetoric of nuclear weapons and regional proxies. This is not fundamentally a story about missiles or uranium enrichment. This is a story about the most powerful weapon in the modern arsenal, financial warfare, and the United States has just deployed it with surgical precision. This is Professor of Money, a place where money moves nation, power bends truth, and history hides its darkest secret. The current escalation began not with a military provocation, but with a Treasury Department announcement on December 15th, 2025. In a tersely worded press release, the United States Treasury designated the entire Iranian banking sector as a zone of primary money laundering concern under Section 311 of the Patriot Act. This obscure piece of financial regulation is the nuclear option of economic warfare. It effectively bans any international bank from doing business with Iranian financial institutions. Any bank that processes a transaction involving Iranian money risks being cut off from the U.S. dollar clearing system, which would be a death sentence for any major financial institution. Within 48 hours of the announcement, European banks that had cautiously maintained minimal ties with Iran severed all connections. Chinese banks, which had been the primary lifeline for Iranian oil sales, began quietly refusing Iranian transactions. Even Russian financial institutions, despite the strategic alliance between Moscow and Tehran, started to back away from direct exposure. The message was clear. The choice was binary. Do business with Iran or do business with the United States. There was no middle ground, but this designation was not an isolated action. It was the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign that had been building for months. In the summer of 2025, as global attention was focused on tensions in the South China Sea and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, the United States was quietly constructing the architecture of Iran's financial strangulation. The Treasury Department expanded its blacklist to include over 200 Iranian entities, front companies, and individuals connected to the oil trade. The State Department pressured key transit countries, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and Iraq, to tighten enforcement of sanctions on Iranian oil smuggling, and most crucially, the U.S. worked behind the scenes with the major oil importing nations to reduce their dependence on Iranian crude. The result was a collapse in Iranian oil exports, the lifeblood of the regime's revenue. By late 2025, Iran's oil exports had fallen to just 400,000 barrels per day, down from a peak of over 2 million barrels in the brief sanctions relief period of 2023. At current prices, this represents a loss of over $100 million per day in revenue, money that the Iranian government desperately needs to fund its military, pay its civil servants, and subsidize basic goods for its population. To fully grasp the magnitude of this economic assault, we must understand the unique vulnerability of the Iranian economy. Iran is not a diversified modern economy like South Korea or Germany. It is a petrostate, overwhelmingly dependent on the export of a single commodity. For over 4 decades, since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, oil has accounted for 60 to 80% of government revenue and nearly 90% of export earnings. This addiction to oil has created a brittle economic structure. The regime never invested seriously in manufacturing, technology, or agriculture. The non-oil sectors of the economy are dominated by inefficient state enterprises and Revolutionary Guard-controlled monopolies. The private sector is strangled by corruption, price controls, and an impossible regulatory environment. The result is an economy that can survive when oil is flowing, but collapses catastrophically when that flow is interrupted, and right now that flow has been reduced to a trickle. The historical roots of this dependency go back to the early 20th century when British geologists discovered oil in Persia in 1908. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would later become BP, turned Iran into one of the world's great oil producers. For For decades, the wealth from this oil flowed primarily to foreign companies and the Iranian monarchy, while the population remained poor. This inequality fueled the nationalist movement led by Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who in 1951 nationalized the oil industry in a direct challenge to British and American interests. The response was swift and brutal. In 1953, the CIA and British intelligence orchestrated a coup that overthrew Mossadegh and restored the Shah to absolute power. This betrayal is burned into the Iranian national consciousness. It is the origin story of the Islamic Republic's deep distrust of the West and its obsession with economic sovereignty. The Shah used oil revenues to build a modern military and pursue rapid industrialization, but his authoritarian rule and close alliance with the United States created a powder keg of resentment that exploded in the 1979 revolution. When Ayatollah Khomeini took power, he promised to free Iran from dependence on both the East and the West. But the reality was different. The new Islamic Republic needed oil revenue just as much as the Shah had. The difference was that now the regime faced international isolation, triggered by the hostage crisis at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. The United States imposed the first sanctions in 1979, freezing Iranian assets and banning most trade. These early sanctions were painful but manageable because global oil demand was high, and other countries were willing to buy Iranian crude. For the next 2 decades, Iran found ways to work around American pressure. It developed networks of front companies and used intermediaries to access international markets. It built close relationships with countries that were themselves at odds with Washington, Russia, China, Syria, and later Venezuela. The regime became expert at sanctions evasion, using barter deals, gold smuggling, and creative shipping methods to keep the oil flowing. But the nature of sanctions changed dramatically in the 21st century with the advent of financial warfare. The turning point came in 2012 when the Obama administration, working with European allies, implemented the most comprehensive sanctions regime ever imposed on a major oil producer. The focus shifted from simply banning American companies from dealing with Iran to cutting Iran off from the global financial system entirely. The mechanism was SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. SWIFT is the messaging system that banks around the world use to transfer money across borders. It is the circulatory system of the global economy. In 2012, under intense pressure from the United States and the European Union, SWIFT disconnected Iranian banks from its network. Overnight, Iran was shut out of the international financial system. The impact was immediate and devastating. Iranian oil exports collapsed. The currency went into freefall. Inflation soared to over 40%. The economy contracted by 9% in a single year. The regime was brought to the negotiating table, and in 2015, it signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, in exchange for sanctions relief. For a brief period between 2016 and 2018, the Iranian economy began to recover. Oil exports surged. Foreign investment started to trickle in, but this reprieve was short-lived. In 2018, President Trump withdrew the United States from the nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions with a policy of maximum pressure. The goal was explicit: to reduce Iranian oil exports to zero and force the regime to renegotiate a more comprehensive agreement that would limit not just its nuclear program, but also its ballistic missile development and its support for proxy forces across the Middle East. The Trump administration's campaign was relentless. It granted no waivers to countries buying Iranian oil. It sanctioned Chinese companies involved in Iranian trade. It threatened secondary sanctions on anyone who did business with Tehran. The Iranian economy once again spiraled into crisis. Inflation hit 50%. The currency lost 70% of its value. Unemployment soared, particularly among the young. The regime responded with defiance, increasing uranium enrichment, attacking oil tankers in the Persian Gulf, and supporting proxy attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria. This brings us to the current moment and the return of Donald Trump to the White House in January 2025. The new administration inherited an Iran that was economically weakened but strategically emboldened. Over the previous 4 years during the Biden presidency, Iran had advanced its nuclear program to the point where it now possessed enough highly enriched uranium to build several nuclear weapons if it chose to do so. It had deepened its alliance with Russia, providing drones that were being used in the war in Ukraine, and it had expanded its network of proxy forces: Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, creating what U.S. strategists call the axis of resistance. The Biden administration had attempted to revive the nuclear deal through indirect negotiations, but these talks collapsed in late 2024 over Iranian demands for guaranteed sanctions relief and American insistence on addressing ballistic missiles and regional activities. The stalemate convinced the new Trump administration that a different approach was needed. The strategy that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than focus on the nuclear issue, which had proven diplomatically intractable, the United States would go directly for the economic jugular. The goal was not regime change through military force, but regime collapse through financial asphyxiation. The calculation was that if the Iranian government could no longer pay its security forces, fund its proxies, or subsidize basic goods for its population, the entire system would implode from within. The Treasury Department became the tip of the spear. The December 2025 designation of the Iranian banking sector was followed by a wave of additional measures. The U.S. sanctioned the National Iranian Oil Company and all of its subsidiaries. It blacklisted every major port facility in Iran. It went after the currency exchange networks that the regime used to convert oil revenues into usable foreign currency. And critically, it pressured the few remaining financial institutions that were still facilitating Iranian transactions, primarily smaller Chinese banks and exchange houses in Dubai. The impact has been catastrophic. The Iranian government is now facing a liquidity crisis unlike anything it has experienced before. It cannot pay its bills. Reports from inside Iran describe ministries running out of basic supplies, hospitals unable to purchase imported medicine, universities unable to pay professors. The Revolutionary Guard, which controls vast swaths of the Iranian economy through its business empire, is seeing its revenue streams dry up. The regime has attempted to respond, but its options are limited. It has tried to use cryptocurrency to evade sanctions, but the volumes are too small to make a meaningful difference. It has attempted to increase barter trade with Russia and China, exchanging oil for goods, but this cannot replace hard currency. It has cracked down on currency speculators and tried to artificially prop up the real, but this has only created a massive black market where the real exchange rate is 3 times the official rate. Meanwhile, the social pressure is building. The Iranian people have endured hardship for years, but there is a breaking point. In recent weeks, protests have erupted in multiple cities. Workers are striking over unpaid wages. Shopkeepers are closing their stores in protest against unbearable inflation. The regime has responded with its usual brutality, deploying riot police and arresting organizers, but the cracks are showing. The security apparatus itself is under strain. When the government cannot pay its enforcers reliably, loyalty becomes negotiable. This is the nightmare scenario for any authoritarian regime, the moment when the instruments of control turn on their masters because the money has run out. The geopolitical implications extend far beyond Iran's borders. This financial warfare campaign is sending a message to every adversary of the United States. It demonstrates that in the modern interconnected economy, military power is not the only form of leverage. Control over the global financial system, the ability to determine who can access dollars, who can use international banks, who can participate in global trade, is a weapon of extraordinary potency. Russia has been feeling the sting of financial sanctions since its invasion of Ukraine in 2022, but those sanctions have been partially offset by continued energy sales to China and India. The Iran playbook suggests that if the United States truly commits to economic warfare, it can isolate even major economies. China is watching these developments with acute concern. The Chinese Communist Party understands that its own vulnerabilities to financial pressure are significant. Despite decades of economic growth, China remains dependent on access to Western markets and the dollar-based financial system. The fear in Beijing is that the same tools being used against Iran could one day be turned against China if tensions over Taiwan escalate to confrontation. For Iran, the options are narrowing. It could accelerate its nuclear program and race for a weapon, betting that nuclear status would give it leverage and protection, but this would almost certainly trigger military action from Israel and possibly the United States. It could lash out through its proxies, attacking U.S. forces in the region or targeting oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But this risks a military response that would be even more devastating than the current economic strangulation. Or it could come to the negotiating table, accepting harsh terms in exchange for sanctions relief. This would require the regime to abandon much of what it has built over 4 decades, its nuclear program, its ballistic missiles, its regional proxies. For a revolutionary regime that defines itself by resistance to American hegemony, this would be a humiliating capitulation. As we look at the unfolding crisis, it becomes clear that this conflict was never really about missiles or nuclear centrifuges. Those are the symptoms, not the disease. The core issue is money and power. The United States is determined to maintain its position as the dominant power in the Middle East and to prevent any regional rival from challenging that dominance. Iran, as the heir to an ancient Persian empire, sees itself as a natural great power and resents subordination to American dictates. For 45 years, these two visions have been irreconcilable, but now the economic vice is tightening to the point where something must give. The Iranian regime will either find a way to survive this financial onslaught or it will collapse, and the method of collapse, whether through internal implosion, negotiated surrender, or a desperate military gamble, will shape the Middle East for a generation. The world is watching a new form of warfare play out in real time. It is a conflict without battlefields, without soldiers in combat, without precision airstrikes lighting up the night sky, but it is no less violent for its abstraction. Economic warfare kills slowly through malnutrition, through lack of medicine, through the despair that comes when a lifetime of savings becomes worthless. The Iranian people are the collateral damage in a strategic game between governments, and as the Iranian economy circles the drain, the question is not whether the regime can survive indefinitely. It is how much suffering the Iranian people will endure before the breaking point is reached. The current U.S.-Iran conflict is indeed about money, not missiles, and money, as it turns out, might be the most devastating weapon of all. Wars aren't fought with bullets first. They're fought with balance sheets. If you want to understand who really wins and who quietly pays the price, subscribe to Professor of Money, because understanding money is understanding the world.